to start. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Ethical Imperative, Global Vaccine Equity. I'm Monica Magalhães. I'm the Program Manager at the Center for Population-Level Bioethics at Rutgers University. And we're here to discuss some of the things that could be done to reduce global health inequalities in access to COVID-19 vaccine, and why developed countries that have vaccines have an ethical obligation to do these things. So the motivation for this event is an open letter that's being sent today to the World Health Organization, signed by some of the panelists that are here with us today. The letter urges the WHO to put a series of vaccine equity measures to a vote in their upcoming assembly this month. So the full text of the letter has been shared in the chat. Please do check that out. Before we start, just procedural notes. We are recording this webinar. We'll make the recording available on the website of the Center for Population-Level Bioethics. We're going to start now. I will introduce our speakers briefly, then we'll have a discussion. So while that's going on, please use the Q&A button to send us your questions. And then after the discussion, the panelists will answer questions for the rest of our time. So just to briefly introduce everyone, Zachariah Kafuku is a molecular biologist, a vaccine equity advocate, and the manager of One Day Africa, a nonprofit organization that promotes medical research in Africa. He is also a challenge trial volunteer with One Day Sooner, an organization that advocates for people who want to volunteer for high impact medical trials, including COVID challenge trials. Dr. Varda Trubitsky is a professor of bioethics at the School of Public Health at the University of Montreal and the president of the International Association of Bioethics. She also chairs the COVID-19 Impact Committee at the Trudeau Foundation in Canada. Dr. Ezekiel Emmanuel is the vice provost for global initiatives and also a professor in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. He also served in President Biden's COVID advisory board during the transition. Dr. Gita Sen is the director and a distinguished professor at the Ramalinga Center on Ethical and Social Determinants of Health at the Public Health Foundation of India. She works extensively on health inequality, social determinants of health, and universal health coverage. She's also a member of the Lancet Commission on synergies between universal health coverage, health security, and health promotion. Dr. Masoka Fala, who will be joining us shortly, is the founder and CEO of Refuge Place International and a lecturer in global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's the lead author of the Open Letter to WHO and a veteran of the response to the Ebola outbreak of 2014, when he led critical aspects of the response in Liberia. So I want to start by turning first to Zach. Zach, can you give us an overview of the global COVID vaccine access situation as it is now, and tell us a bit more about this open letter?
Thank you so much, Monica, for the introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. So the first word I would use to describe the global access in terms of COVID-19 vaccines is that the situation is disproportionate, it's dire, and for the most part, it accounts to an injustice. So globally, from the time that the COVID-19 pandemic began, we've seen more than 3 million lives lost globally. The IMF estimates that about $28 trillion have been lost due to the pandemic. So the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic has not spared any part of the world, and neither should the response towards that. So if we try to assess how the distribution of the COVID-19 vaccines that first began to be used late December 2020, we noticed that there's a pattern. So the wealthy countries in the world have been getting the majority share of the vaccines. Now, to put that into perspective, so in terms of purchases, according to the Global Health Institute at Duke, 88% of all the vaccines that have been developed that are authorized currently have gone to the wealthy countries. Now, if you do the math, you realize that only about 11.2% of the remaining vaccines are actually going to the low and medium income countries. Now, if you think about that for a moment, 88% is quite a huge chunk, especially that the wealthy countries only account for less than 20% of the global population. So there is a lot of lion's share taking. And if you go to the assessment of the actual administration of the doses, how many doses have actually gone into the arms of people, according to Bloomberg, the estimate is that 1.34 billion doses have been administered globally. Now, out of these numbers, if you get down to the global south, let's begin with Asia. So according to the statistics, only about 3% of these doses have actually been administered in Asia. 3%, not 30%, 3%. And then only 0.7% have been administered in Africa. Now, these are disturbing numbers. If you really think about that, they are very, very disturbing numbers. So what is the problem? The problem is with inequality when it comes to access to these vaccines. So there are people who are getting more vaccines while others are just sitting and waiting. And this kind of situation is one that cannot be allowed to go on. The World Health Organization on 11th March declared the COVID-19 as a pandemic, global pandemic, meaning that it affected all parts of the world, so to speak, which means that, as I mentioned earlier, even the response, the steps that are taken should be global in approach. And this statement has been going on for a long time now, that no one is safe until everyone is safe. The situation is that as long as there's a portion of people around the world that are not vaccinated, the pandemic will continue to rage on. And this is why we are now seeing new variants coming on. There are countries around the world, rich countries, that have stockpiled, and others that have bought vaccines in excess, enough to vaccinate their population 5 times over. 5 times over. And there are countries around the world which have not even gotten a single dose to this date. So how is it that other countries can have even 5 times enough to vaccinate their populations over, while other countries don't have? So this was the reason why this letter was brought up. So the letter is the one that discusses the asks that are being sent to the World Health Organization through the World Health Assembly. Now, some of the specific asks of the letter may sound somewhat familiar to some people, or to some of you who have been following this issue very well. So among the asks that the open letter has put down is that each country should endorse the necessity and ethical agency of supporting the goals and means of WHO's access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, or the ACT program. And then the other ask is that each country should endorse the following ethical standard. All countries that have ordered more doses than they can use should immediately commit to donate these excess doses either to COVAX or directly to the countries that are most in need. And apart from that, the G8 countries, that means all the wealthy countries and all other countries that are above the 11,200 GDP per capita, should commit at least 10% of their total expenditure on vaccines to COVAX to help in terms of purchasing doses for people in low and medium-income countries. And finally, all pharmaceutical companies should either use a multi-tiered pricing for vaccines for low and medium-income countries, or if they can't do this, then they can waive their patent protection for such countries to have the ability to manufacture generics to help to end the pandemic quicker. And apart from this, obviously, they have to support the tech transfer for such kind of manufacturing. Now, as I mentioned, this is something that maybe some of us have heard before. So what makes this open letter unique in its way? What makes the letter unique is this letter is being sent to the World Health Assembly through the World Health Organization, of course. And the rules are that when the issue is tabled as an agenda during the World Health Assembly, every country is going to be required to vote on the record, which means we set ourselves a precedent and also a reference for the future when we talk about future pandemic preparedness. If a country says no to these asks, then it will go on record. And that's important as we discuss this kind of things, especially going into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zach. So now let's move straight into the ethics part of the conversation. And I want to ask Vardit, is there an ethical imperative to extend access to vaccines to the whole world? And if there is, why? Why should the US or Canada or other countries share vaccines or share their resources with developing countries to help?
Thank you, Monica. Yes, there absolutely is an ethical imperative to extend access to vaccines to countries that struggle to have such access. Why? The answer seems so intuitive and commonsensical that it's almost sad it needs to be articulated. First, on deontological grounds, we should do whatever we can, obviously, to protect lives and limit harm. These values are recognized by all ethical theories. Second, we should be guided by considerations of justice and equity. People deserve equal moral concern, and their lives matter regardless of where they happen to live. As noted by Zeke and others, even if you think some degree of vaccine nationalism is justified, unlimited national partiality is clearly not. You know, last night I explained to my 14-year-old daughter what this event is about. And she said, it's like when you're hungry. It might be okay to eat and feed your family first, but if someone else is starving, it's clearly unethical to eat until you're exploding or keep extra food just in case you'll need it later. So if a 14-year-old gets it, I think we all can. Another value is that of prioritizing those who are disadvantaged. Think of being sick in a context where you have access to hospitals, ICUs, ventilation, social support for your family, versus being sick in a context where you have no healthcare available to you and nowhere to go. Vaccines are needed everywhere, but in some contexts, they are needed more. National governments have responsibilities to respond to fundamental, basic humanitarian needs in other countries, such as healthcare, as we now see with the oxygen crisis in India, and such as vaccines that are needed to prevent such tragic scenarios from spreading. Governments have these responsibilities, especially in an emergency, especially when they have the required resources, such as extra vaccines, and especially when policy decisions, such as the one about patents, can save millions of lives. Now, on utilitarian grounds, herd immunity is not just a local concept. In some ways, it is a global one. Some expressions in the literature have captured this. The virus does not recognize borders. Failing to contain the spread of the disease anywhere puts people at risk elsewhere, everywhere. And as Zach just said, no one is safe until everyone is safe. So if it takes years for low and middle income countries to have access to enough vaccines, aggressive variants could emerge that might make current vaccines ineffective or less effective. As the global north reopens the international travel, and we all are eager to go back to seeing colleagues and family around the world, this is a threat that to everyone in every country. So there are strong utilitarian arguments in favor of equitable vaccine allocation, even if you are a passionate vaccine nationalist. Various models have been proposed for what ethical, equitable distribution might look like, one of them by a group led by Zeke. I won't get into these nuances right now because we can discuss them together later. There are some disagreements about the principles that should underlie allocation, but there is also agreement on the core values that I just highlighted. So to conclude my answer, Monica, I want to say this. The decisions we make now will be analyzed and scrutinized in the future. We're facing a unique, unprecedented moment, and we need to ask ourselves, what will be the ethical heritage we leave behind? We will be judged by future generations who will look back at what we do now. They will either say, in a moment of great global threat, they acted cowardly, they thought narrowly, they forgot what mattered, and they abandoned each other. Or they will say they did the right thing, They showed solidarity and responsibility. They acted based on their shared humanity. So I hope we choose to be on the right side of history.
Thank you for that. And it does seem extremely persuasive. So I do want to then turn to Zeke to talk about one potential objection to their very persuasive case. So opponents of the kind of initiative that this open letter advocates for argue that waiving patent protections or limiting vaccine prices may work as a disincentive for quick development of vaccines for future COVID variants or future emerging infections. So the ethical objection might be then that by committing to these initiatives, rich countries are compromising the interests of their own vulnerable population to promote the interests of poorer countries. So in your view, do those initiatives really create this kind of incentive problems? Then can they be mitigated? And if to the extent that they can't, then how do we weigh up the obligations of rich countries to poorer countries versus their obligations to their own vulnerable populations? Sorry, you're muted.
Everyone's better off when I'm muted. It's really important for all of us to understand that leaders of countries have ethical obligations by dint of being elected or as leaders of their country. And one of their, maybe the primary ethical obligation they have as leaders and political officials is to promote the health and well-being of their citizenry. That is what they are elected to do. And it's really important for all of us to understand that in a time of a global pandemic and a global emergency, that is really fundamentally their goal. But that cannot be construed in a narrow way, because as Zach and as we all know, infectious diseases transmit across borders. We've seen this with the UK B117 variant, which started out maybe in the UK, we don't actually know for sure, but has spread to every country. And so we need to be concerned as leaders, not just about our situation, but about other situations. Second, in pursuing the health and well-being of our own citizens, it's important for leaders to understand, given the data we have now, that we don't have to reach herd immunity to have a dramatic impact on life and the spread of the virus. We merely have to look at Israel and the UK, two countries that have not gotten to herd immunity. Neither have 70% of their population or 80% of their population fully vaccinated. They are just over 60% and just under 60%. And yet, life is returning very much to normal. And you can see that the health and well-being of the country is being pursued. So what should political leaders do? Well, we've now entered a phase, certainly in Britain and the United States, and even Israel too, where we have surplus vaccine in these countries. We have a situation where the production of vaccine exceeds the demand. In the United States, we have seen the interest in vaccines go down and down and down over the last few weeks. The maximum vaccination was nearly a month ago, April 13th, I believe, at about 3.4 million people vaccinated on a 7-day average, but now we are down below 2.3 million. That means that we have more than enough supply of vaccine. As we have argued, that puts a moral imperative on us to actually share our vaccine with others and to begin exporting these vaccines. Today, the United States sits on about 60 to 65 million excess doses of vaccine. Moderna, Pfizer, J&J, we're producing between 3 and 4 million vaccine a day in excess of demand. We need to share this vaccine and export it to other countries where it can be used. It's critically important that we export ethically, that we distribute the vaccine ethically to justify to the population and the citizenry of the countries that by exporting the vaccine, we're really helping the world and not wasting the vaccine. Unfortunately, we have seen some wastage in vaccine. That is a tremendous tragedy. We've seen vaccine go to countries that can't actually store it, vaccine go to countries that can't actually administer it. So not only do we have to export excess or surplus vaccine, we also need to help countries with their ability to administer the vaccine. And those vaccines need to go to countries that are hard hit by COVID, countries that are suffering greatly because of COVID. Top of mind, India, Mongolia, Latin America, Cyprus, Turkey. There is unfortunately, a long list of countries. We need to get, every political leader needs to begin sharing the vaccine to curtail the explosion of the pandemic in those countries so that in the enlightened self-interest of protecting the health and well-being of their own citizens, so variants that are resistant to the current vaccines are not brought back into the country, don't circulate in the world. So even skeptics, vaccine nationalists and others really have to understand that we need to share vaccine, that it is in the interest of political leaders and in countries to share excess vaccine. And we now know that we can go back to a normal life at about 50 or 60% of the population vaccinated and do the moral thing, as Vardit has pointed out, of sharing vaccines with the world and helping everyone we can who is now being afflicted by COVID. And I believe that is where the world has to be headed and will be headed, because the moral imperative here is also the right policy imperative.
Thank you very much. And that connects us to the next question I wanted to ask. I wanted to go to Gita and see if, can you give us an overview, tell us a little more about the difference that having earlier vaccination reach the global south could make?
Sure. Thanks, Monica. And the previous three speakers have laid out a whole bunch of things so well, I don't need to repeat them. So I'm going to use my time not to repeat them. Obviously, we've heard about the huge inequality and inequity between North and South to just shortcut the description. We've heard the argument that we're either going to sink or swim together in terms of recovery, health recovery from this pandemic. I want to highlight a couple of other things which I think are critical. When you have such severe shortages as there now are in the global south, that in itself generates huge inequalities within countries because the pressures on governance become almost impossible or unbearable. And if you're thinking about LDC, least developed countries settings, or even LMIC settings, governance is not such that when you've got acute shortages, you can actually manage equity and ensure that whatever there is well distributed. So it actually worsens the inequality within countries. The second critical thing is that health systems are collapsing, and they're collapsing. And what does that mean? Not only in terms of health workers and supplies, but other services are falling apart. Things such as polio vaccinations, TB care, programs for gender-based violence, even perennials like maternal and antenatal care, and of course, care for NCDs, non-communicable diseases. The services simply have been diverted to handle what is happening because the numbers of cases are increasing at such a pace, and these because of the absence of prevention, adequate prevention through vaccination. That's not, we stand to lose decades of advances against things like standard epidemic, problems in health because of the absence of adequate prevention. There's two more things that are crucial. You won't be able to prevent vaccine escape if you don't have, and vaccine escape basically means mutations to variants that will basically jump your immunization systems. That's what's happening with a number of the variants that are emerging. And as long as the pandemic is raging in some parts of the world, don't imagine that because you are vaccinated, you're going to be safe in the other parts of the world. So vaccine escape will be a serious problem. And very importantly, the global economy isn't going to come back. The global economy has got to be able to walk on all legs that it has. It's not going to walk simply on the leg of the wealthy northern countries. If you don't have the southern countries able to come in and do their part in the global economy, forget it. The global economy simply isn't going to come back. So for all of those reasons, it's absolutely crucial that we look at this as a collective problem for the world. But let me, if I have 2 minutes, let me say something about what I think is an even bigger question, because what I've said up to this point is almost like, you know, it's not rocket science. We can see this. The bigger question is how? How can southern countries actually get to vaccines? And not only vaccines, there are shortages not just of oxygen, there's shortages of health workers, there's shortages of equipment, there's shortages of diagnostics, there's shortages on every front. So it's not just vaccines that we need to be talking about. I'm going to speak in a minute about what I think is a potential game changer that has just happened within the last couple of days. And I'm not referring to the Biden administration on its support for the waiver. But first, let me say, there are 4 questions that are crucial that we need to address here. First, is there production capacity to produce enough vaccines? And if so, where is it? Secondly, is there know-how? And is there access to technology? And clearly, IPR's intellectual property rights are a huge barrier, regardless of what Bill Gates may say. Bill Gates now says nobody in the South is able to produce vaccines. The factories don't exist. And I just say, open your eyes, Bill. What are you talking about? Most of the many of the vaccines that you're talking about today are produced in the South. They're not being produced only in the North. So where do you think this capacity has gone? There's tons of capacity to produce what we need. Thirdly, is there a willingness to market? And this is where I think, even with the best will in the world, if we were to rely on the big pharmaceutical companies out of the goodness of their hearts to do voluntary licensing with their intellectual property rights completely protected at whatever price, they're not willing to do it. They haven't done it for the past year, and they're not willing to do it. And that is why WHO's COVAX facility is limping along. It's meant to provide just 20% vaccines for the population of the world. And it's nowhere near being able to even do that. And that's because pharma just isn't playing. It's not playing. It's refusing to come in to play. It speaks the language, but it doesn't actually come in to take up the market commitments to do that. And of course, the big fourth question, at what price? Let me say very quickly, and this is my final point, there are three places that from where the vaccines could come. Big pharma, and I think they've shown themselves profoundly unwilling to play that role during this. We've had a whole year to watch this. Secondly, production in the South, it exists provided WTO will do the waiver that India and South Africa have been pushing. If that goes through, production will kick in the South. But the last one is the game changer. China and maybe Russia. And the biggest thing that has happened in the last couple of days is that the COVAX facility has finally given approval to China's Sinopharm vaccine. That means China, which can produce 5 billion doses a year of vaccines, can now sell Sinopharm through the COVAX facility. Now let's watch the fun and games as Big Pharma will find that its game is going to be cut out. It's taken 5 unconscionable months for WHO, the COVAX facility, not WHO, the COVAX facility to approve Sinopharms coming into COVAX. Now it's in. Sinovac is almost on the threshold of coming in. The game is changing, and it's going to change regardless of whether they agree to a waiver, don't agree to a waiver. The Chinese are in, and I think the others are going to come in as well. Let me leave you with that.
Thank you. That gives us a lot already to discuss in our next section about steps we can take for future pandemics. But before we do that, I just want to turn to Musoka for lessons from previous pandemics. So Musoka, this open letter is led by yourself and 28 other leaders of the response to the 2014 Ebola pandemic. So can you tell us a little more about the lessons in international cooperation in infectious disease outbreaks that we should have learned from that pandemic and should be applying to this one?
Thank you very much. Like the previous speaker said, most of our earlier speakers already laid the basis, the theoretical basis and the philosophical basis, ethical morals. I actually led this effort when I realized that I was a bit disillusioned. What did I say? I was shocked because I was involved in the evolution of the Ebola virus vaccine, the current Ebola vaccine. I can't remember one day I was approached and said, Musoka, we want to do clinical trials in Liberia, but there's no one that understands the dynamic of Ebola equal to you. Can you take us to some of the hotspots so we can design studies, do a knowledge assessment and attitude towards vaccine for us to do a clinical trial? There were riots. Actually, we had to use a bulletproof vehicle to go to the site of the vaccine. That's how risky it was. We got there, we engaged the community on the issue of vaccine in the midst of an outbreak, and we decided that it is possible to have the vaccine. In the midst of the greatest Ebola outbreak, we launched the vaccine. We were able to immunize about 1,500 to show that the vaccine was safe. Some of the findings from Liberia went to develop the ring vaccine in Guinea. And eventually I was in the DRC during the 2018 Ebola outbreak, when that vaccine was rolled out in the DRC. I was called upon by Merck to serve as one of the African expert committee on the licensing and the post-licensure avenue for the current Ebola vaccine. I remember being in Paris, where in Paris there were multiple partners from the US military, MSF, CDC, and we're discussing the concept of the vaccine. And then very suspicious, I raised my hand and said, how much is this vaccine going to cost? Some of us have risked our lives being involved. And one of the Merck representatives said, it's not going to cost the country anything. I said, what do you mean? Is this realistic or is business talk? And he made a profound statement to me. He said there are times when profit does not matter. There are times it's not always about profit. It's about investing in humanity. The profit comes later. We were to follow that discussion. In Senegal, we met to look at the post-essential, and we all agree on the issue of a common stockpile for all countries, and that wherever the country will need Ebola vaccine, the vaccine will go there. It will be managed by the International Coordinating Group, WHO, UNICEF. And so we developed the platform in Senegal. We came to the conclusion. And so you saw that when Ebola struck Guinea, within 1 week, the vaccine was in Guinea. So I was of the conviction, I was very heartily following the evolution of the COVID vaccine. It had threatened humanity. Airlines had stopped flying. Our very existence and human beings were threatened. And then I get an article from one of my friends in Geneva to tell me that the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine will be sold at such an exorbitant price. I started to write my friends. I said, I cannot believe this. This is incredible. There's just no way any country in Africa is going to afford this. One, they've already paid a lot of price for the lockdown. Number two, and I wrote an article in a magazine and said, no country is an island. If we try to move this profit margin, this outbreak will never end, because it reminds me of someone's statement I said, the neglected spot of today are the hot spot of tomorrow. The neglected spot of today becomes the hot spot of tomorrow that feed the outbreak. When Ebola started in Liberia, it was insignificant, later in Guinea. Eventually, it went around the world. We are a global village today. We see that Africa has minimal testing capacity. We don't know the extent of the virus spread. Even in Africa, neither do we know the extent of the variant strain. For our own very existence as humanity, it is important that, like the guy from Merck said to me, that for a moment we try to see whether the profit issue can be laid aside. The billions and billions we want to make here, we have to incentivize the pharmaceutical community for invention, but like was said with the Ebola, sometimes it's not all about profit. Sometimes it's about humanity. Sometimes it's about our very survival. There's no way wealthy nations will receive vaccines and think they can survive with the mutations, except the nations become island. If the wealthy nations do not become islands by themselves and no one flies in, then they can be safe. But we do know that our existence is so interdependent that there's no way we're going to do this. The last time I saw the inferno from India, from the cremation of the bodies, and I was running down in tears. And I wrote my friend Zach, I said, if 25% of this happened to Africa, Africa will cease to exist. It has no near the capacity, the infrastructure of India. So basically, we come back and say, we saw this happen at the end of World War II, when there was a Marshall Plan, when the wise leader of the US realized that the survival of the US to thrive depended on improving the lives of Europeans. The same way with this vaccine, the survival of the great nations of the North cannot go ahead without the countries, the least country, because those countries are going to be the hotspot of tomorrow that will spread outbreaks to the bigger country. And it's possible, it is doable. From Liberia to Sierra Leone to Guinea and DRC, we saw a multi-collaborative efforts, multiple scientists running clinical trials. We went to multiple countries discussing the Ebola vaccine. It is not equal in proportion and magnitude, but there is a precedence in place. And the famous epidemiologist, Hans Rosling, said to me one time, Hans Rosling, the late, came from Sweden to help us. One morning, and I was sitting working on the Ebola transmission. He said something to me, Musoka, remember this thing. Whatever you do in Liberia protects the UK and USA. I said, how is it? He said, if you do a careless work, Ebola will travel to the US and UK. So see yourself as a global citizen. Whatever is done in the North, once the poor countries are excluded, it is a way for us to have the disease to spread. So we've demonstrated that there can be global collaboration. There can be a global will. There can be a will that can supersede self-interest. There can be a global will that can supersede maximizing profit and producing billionaires and then work upon the debts, the broken homes. Look at India today and see people dying. So this is the key issue. And the last two things that I will say in the last article I wrote was one, we've always been told that vaccine is a global health good. Let us stick to that word. If it is indeed true that we all have agreed In all our heads, that vaccine was a public health good. Let's maintain that. If it's a public health good, then it's good for everyone, not some people. Lastly, in the global health security agenda, we have said immunization is a critical way of protecting humanity. Now all humanity have equal access, equal economic ability. So let us not deny people because of their economic condition or their geography. By doing this, the shared humanity faces extinction because we are one group of people. And so we've demonstrated that we can work together, collaborate to protect the world. That's why we are coming back to appeal to our human conscience to have a global and a new master plan that will protect these countries, all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we move to audience questions, I just want to throw a couple of other questions to the entire panel. If you want to comment, just unmute or raise your hand. So I want to start following on Osoka's important points. How do we do then in the next pandemic? What are some things, or what's the best thing that we could do differently on vaccine development and on global access from the start? So for one example, so WHO proposed a single unified adaptive trial that would test all potential COVID vaccines against one another and against placebo. So would something like that, do you think, could work in the future? Would it give countries a readier claim, a readier access to products of a global experiment like this? Or would do you have other ideas that you think we should be looking to implement whenever the next COVID variant or emerging infection comes along?
I think I'll go first. So my first response to that would be, I think the initial approach that was taken when the pandemic started, I think there was a lot of, for the lack of a better term, I think there was complacency on the part of many players in this response. I think there were several suggested approaches to try and, first of all, mitigate the impact of the pandemic early on, and secondly, to look at potential solutions. And there was a lot of debate. Of course, we spent a lot of time in debates and arguing on what was the best and the most ethical approach to take. And ultimately, while we're busy discussing, the pandemic was raging on. And now today we are counting 3.2 million lives that have been lost. Even now, if I ask you to start counting from 1 to 3 million, how long will it take you to reach 3 million? And yet these just sound like numbers, but these are lives. These are people with families. These are, people who are loved by their communities. So I think in terms of future pandemic preparedness, the first approach is we need to be a bit more proactive. I think let's get to a point where all the possible solutions are given their due merit. Now, maybe as I speak now, I speak a little bit biased because I am a firm believer in challenge studies and challenge trials. And this was suggested way back, more than a year ago, right? And we spent a lot of time in this discussion and arguing about this and arguing about that. And ultimately now, the UK is conducting challenge studies. Ultimately, they've happened. The only thing that has changed between the time this campaign started and now is the number of people that have died while we are still debating. And the other approach, apart from taking on all the available options on the table, the other approach is the part of the problem that has been created right now, especially with regard to vaccine inequity or inequality, is that the development or manufacturing capacity has been centered in the global north. Now, this in part maybe is a political issue, but also a public health issue. Collaboration between the global north and the global south must be seen to work even now, and especially when the future pandemics do come at play. If we had a way to quickly begin the collaboration like it was done during the Ebola outbreak that Mosoka mentioned, what helped the outbreak in West Africa to quickly be controlled is the collaboration. Many experts, epidemiologists, doctors, physicians traveled from Europe, from America to go to West Africa to go and help. This kind of collaboration is what we need, and this is the kind of collaboration that we should be thinking of putting down in the future pandemics. So collaboration and also creating a deliberate effort to distribute manufacturing capacity. Because as long as the manufacturing capacity is centered in the global north, the global south will continue to be waiting and begging for vaccines to be accessible. Because the countries that are going to be producing these vaccines, as Zeke Mano mentioned, their leaders will have some kind of a political, a responsibility. I'm not going to call it an ethical responsibility. I'm going to call it a political responsibility to their electorate or their citizens to protect them. And meanwhile, other people around the world, other human beings around the world are dying. Thank you.
Thank you. Mosoka, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to start with the combining what Zach has said, is that within the framework of the global health security, we have three key words. We have prevent, detect, and response. Let's ask ourselves effectively, how effective are we in detection? That's the ability, the capacity to detect emerging infectious diseases. That was one of our weaknesses. The disease started from one country, we're not able to detect, two, we're not able to prevent it. There were several mistakes we made before we went down, and it gradually spread, and our response capacity and timing. We wanted to come back together and see we cannot survive another round of pandemic like this. But our ability to detect within a narrow geographical confine and prevent it from spreading within that confine, and overwhelming response that will take away political division is going to be very critical. It will require equal investment across both the North and the South to enhance our ability to first prevent. If we cannot prevent by studying those factors that promote emerging infectious diseases, if we can, then our next best bet is to prevent through immunization, through advanced laboratory technique, and having a collaborative way to respond out of politics so that we don't delay our ability to inform the world when a disease is come, so that the economic and the political expediency does not exceed the countries and global needs. So preventing, detecting, and responding collaboratively is going to be our first most important power. By the time we get to all the other measures, the damage has been done, irreversible and complicated. Just to support it. Thank you.
Thank you. And before audience questions, I just wanted to throw out one more question that kind of follows from Gita's remarks. So far, we've been discussing the obligations of rich countries. Do you think that pharmaceutical companies have their own obligations towards low and middle income countries, maybe in general, maybe those that hosted vaccine trials, and some of those, as we know, are not now getting the vaccines that they need? Or is it only states that have these obligations, and then those can be met in part by requiring these companies to take certain actions?
Do you want me to come in? I think the short answer is yes, but I have absolutely no faith in the moral or ethical stance of pharmaceutical companies that have already earned billions of dollars. We've all seen the Pfizer first quarter figures, $3.5 billion in profits, and Moderna is expected to earn $19 billion in profits. Can someone tell me how much Moderna invested of its own money to produce the mRNA vaccines that it produced? It was US taxpayer money. It was US government money. Public funds go into the R&D of pharmaceutical companies. They privatize the profits, and the costs are public. If that is the case, then we need to make the rules of the game such, because there have been a number of questions that I've seen on the chat, which are very much along the lines of charity obligations. This is not about charity. The global system will not function on the basis of charity. It is a system that has to work on the basis of fair and ethical rules of the game. And I do believe that the WTO TRIPS rules of the game, when applied to health emergencies, are a disaster. There is absolutely no question about that. When they were agreed to, countries had their arms twisted in order to deal with that. One only has to go back to see how the world was able finally in Africa to get out of the HIV disaster. It could never have happened but for the fact that India had still not agreed to change its patent rules to comply with TRIPS. And because it had not yet changed its patent rules, it could produce, and it was able thereby to drop. Cipla dropped the price of the ARV cocktails from over $10,000 to $100. And that's how people stopped dying of HIV/AIDS in Africa the last time. That's no longer the case. India is now under TRIPS rules. Everybody is under TRIPS rules. And the problem is even the least developed countries, which are supposed to have exceptions and extensions to the TRIPS rules, are begging for an extension. These are the countries that have only 15% of the world's population, but 50% of the population living under extreme poverty. The least developed countries are begging for another extension so that to the TRIPS rules from WTO. We can't have those kinds of rules of the game. The rules of the game are unethical, they're unfair, they're unjust. When it comes to public health, I'm not generally against patents or intellectual property rights, but when it comes to public health and health emergencies, they've functioned in the past as a disaster. In this pandemic, they're a complete disaster. Let me just say one thing, because a couple of questions inevitably have come up about India in the chat that I was seeing. And of course, the situation is in India is a disaster compounded of multiple things. It's a disaster compounded, I would say, of three things basically. One, far too early declaration of success. After the first wave, India thought it was doing very well. There weren't that many deaths. There wasn't that much infection. Declared success too quickly. Other countries have done that as well. European countries have done that and then quickly had to scramble back in order to impose lockdowns. That's not the only reason though. The second reason is hubris. There's no question, and people have asked the question about governance hubris, and there's no question but that has played a very major role in this. But there's a third one. The variant that is now ravaging India is attacking young people. The proportions of young people who are dying are much, much higher under this variant. It's not just an old people's pandemic anymore. That means, and this goes to Dan's question in the chat, Dan Wickler asked the question, what do I have to say about vaccine nationalism, particularly given that India has reneged on its commitments to COVAX? I'd say two things, Dan. India just doesn't have the vaccines at this point. Do you know what proportion of India has been vaccinated? Under 3%, in the middle of a massively ravaging. The official estimates of death are about 1/5 at a minimum of the actual deaths. Probably Indian deaths are over 1 million already. Even though the official figures are by design much lower than that. In that context, we don't even have 3% of the population vaccinated at this point. To whom is the government? The government before the current spike was actually giving out vaccines to other countries, and now is being kicked by everybody in the country saying, what on earth were you thinking when you hadn't even vaccinated your most vulnerable populations? There are no vaccines in India at this point. And if we're talking about vaccine nationalism, you know, Angela Merkel, who I admire for a lot of other things, except this had us very, you know, I would say, Angela, what's Germany doing about it? What's Germany's contribution to COVAX at this point? What's the UK's contribution to COVAX at this point? Why is it that COVAX is begging for money and doses of vaccines at this point? It's not India that's the primary problem in terms of vaccine nationalism. And I don't say it as a person who is supportive of the Indian government by any means. There are many things that are well worth criticizing there, but you can't expect a country that hasn't vaccinated even 3% of its population in the middle of the most horrendous. I can't even tell you how bad it is here right now. We are all seeing people dying around us, people we know, people, our friends, family. And I am upper middle class. Think of what's happening among the poor in that case. There's no vaccines that India has to give to anybody at this point.
So let me chime in, because Gita and I agree on one fundamental point. You are not going to create a situation that addresses deep public health emergencies like a pandemic based on charity. That is not a strong foundation today or going forward. You need the right incentives, and we need to create a system that has the right incentives. What are the right situation? We need rapid development of vaccines today and in the future, especially for potential variants to COVID, but for future potential grave pandemic threats. Second, we need to have an incentive for a fair distribution of those vaccines when we develop them. We need to have investment in not just distributing them, but also having countries have the capacity to administer them so no vaccines go to waste, which we're now seeing in South Sudan and Malawi and Congo and other countries. The right incentives. Now, Gita was very upset, and here's where we disagree, by Pfizer making $3.5 billion on the vaccine and Moderna making $19 billion. I believe it was Zach at the very start mentioned the estimates that the world is losing over $10 trillion from this pandemic. An investment of $20 billion, 25, even $100 billion in vaccines going to the companies to make the vaccine in record time does not seem to me the wrong incentive. It seems to me exactly the right incentive. We want people to develop a vaccine, to invest their own capital, to go to venture capitalists and say, this is worthwhile to do. Why do we know we have to do that? One of the reasons is not every company that started out in this process was successful. GSK, Sanofi failed. We need lots of companies who want to enter this to create the vaccine or the booster for the variant and in the next pandemic. And a financial incentive is a very good incentive when it's peanuts compared to the economic loss that the entire world is experiencing. If we're not going to rely on charity, we have to rely on economic incentives. That doesn't mean, and this is the important point, that doesn't mean we can have an unfair distribution of vaccine among countries when it comes to the vaccine. And we do need to distribute the vaccine properly. What does that mean? I think Gita has been quite persuasive here. It means distributing the vaccine to countries that are really experiencing devastation from COVID, and more importantly, are likely to experience bad COVID outbreaks. Why? Because that's how we reduce deaths. That's how we reduce the economic devastation that the world is experiencing it. And that is extremely important. One of the hesitations, I would say, that companies and other countries have in distributing vaccine is we shouldn't do it on the basis of population. We need to do it on the basis of COVID burden. That is absolutely essential. And that means that the vaccine goes to places like India, South America, Mongolia, and places that are really suffering from COVID, not places that are not suffering from COVID.
Let me come in, please. I really want to come in to address a couple of issues that Emmanuel raised. The issue of charity, the issue of breeding. Let me start with the breeding statement. 6 weeks ago, India would not have qualified for the vaccine because there was no data to show that India was not threat. And we saw a massive explosion in India. The first thing we must realize, there is massive underreporting of cases and testing in undeveloped country. 6 weeks ago, India was very contented and said everything was okay, the data was okay. So 6 weeks ago, there were political rallies, there were religious gatherings in India. That's the first thing. The second thing, let me make it clear. This argument is not an argument of charity. Why would the US go to Afghanistan or Iraq? It's an issue of human security. It's not an issue of charity basket. That's what I say in my closing statement. Except the developed country decide to become island, they become island in and of themselves and no other one can go. In the absence of that, with the US and Britain having only 2 to 5% investment in sequencing surveillance, there is no way to know the rate at which mutations are happening, the rate at which there is human movement. If we shut down the world today and nobody move, then okay. But what we're saying is more beyond charity to share human security. That's one. We have to see this from the security argument. It's no more about charity. There are moral imperative, but then we saw what happened with the P1 in South America. One time ago, the young people were protected. Gita said nowadays the young people are targeted with the new mutations. We don't know what's going to happen as the disease spread further among humanity. So much that there was a finding yesterday of people that left from India to China. The diagnostic test did not pick them up. They had to do X-ray and other advanced testing. There could be mutation that would defeat every one of our testing mechanisms, and we go back to zero. We must see this as our shared humanity, the threat to our security, and let's forget the charity. The third statement about Sudan mismanaging the vaccine. These were the very statements that were used on Africa when it came to HIV/AIDS. They cannot tell the time. It was said that HIV/AIDS drugs cannot come to Africa because the Africans cannot tell time. But we saw that statement defeated. So my third point I want to say, if we stay and wait for the breeding of COVID-19, we will see countries going into India very soon. Because weeks ago, we did not know, we all were relaxed. India will relax, the world will relax because we don't have good data. It's not a charity issue anymore. It goes beyond charity. It's about our shared human existence where economy will collapse, nation will collapse, human life will be lost across everywhere. And finally, vaccine has been used in African countries and other developed countries for a long time. And the COVAX platform has been released in many countries, it's been tested. We have to put this into the clear context that is about humanity. If it is about humanity, then we'll begin to think whether it should be driven always just by profit, immediate profit. If General Marshall, after World War II, had thought about immediate profit, they would not have invested mightily in Germany. There was an issue of a threat to communism, of human common threat. Where are we dealing with now today? It's no more a charity basket case. It's about our survival as humanity. It's about meeting our sanity and our economy. These are the points I want to raise. It is so difficult, if not impossible, to determine the true breeding of COVID in the world. Thank you.
Monica, I wanted to come back on the IPR question, but I'll do that at the end. if I may, or are we at the end?
We have 20 minutes and so many questions.
I'd love to hear Vardit and Zach say something before I come back. I don't want to monopolize this discussion.
So I have a bit of a challenge here from my colleague Suka on whether are there any grounds for prioritizing countries when it comes to vaccine exports, not only on the basis of need, but also relating to the to how their current elected leaders have responded to the pandemic. So he gives the example of Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, who he says have responded recklessly, whereas in other countries that has not been the case, and they were still overwhelmed by COVID. And I'm thinking this is not so much, I know Moussaka has already addressed the kind of fallacies around capacity for response. And we know that's not true. Africa has the capacity, Brazil certainly also has the capacity, but just the current governments haven't responded effectively for whatever reasons, not a lack of capacity.
Can I make 3 points about that point?
Case? Please
there are 3 simple answers. First of all, citizens should not be held responsible for the incompetence of their country. That people are dying in India because Modi allowed political rallies, allowed religious rallies, that is not acceptable. Second, the fact of the matter is we should be using vaccines to save lives, reduce economic deprivations, not as a result of desert, what they did in the past. This is not a reward for past behavior. This is about saving future lives, saving and reducing economic deprivations. So we should not think about it as desert. We need to be forward-looking, not backward-looking in the case of vaccines. And third, let me remind the people, both Britain and the United States and Israel had disastrous responses to the vaccine, to the virus, disastrous, but have had very good rollouts of vaccines. So you cannot extrapolate from incompetence in one area to competence in another. And I think partially the difference is experience. Places that have done a very good job in responding to the virus, Taiwan comes to mind, South Korea comes to mind, had experience with SARS in 2003, prepared for it, hiring the right people, stockpiling PPE, having early warning systems. Places that did a good job in terms of vaccines, Britain and the United States as examples, had long-standing vaccine research experience, had a whole ecosystem for investing, science, academia, and companies to develop vaccines. These things didn't come out of nowhere, and there are reasons, it's called experience, and learning from the past that are really important. So there are 3 good reasons why incompetent government should not determine where we send the vaccine, as long as the country has the capacity to administer the vaccine and administer it effectively so we're not wasting these very, very valuable resources.
But anyone else?
Monica, I want to make sure we don't run out of time before we discuss a critical point, and I'm going to jump on what Zeke just said about how we cannot extrapolate from one area of competence or incompetence to another. At the same time, we know that even if the right thing happens and vaccine and resources and capacity is allocated, one country, one government cannot control what then another government does with what it gets. So I want to tie back to the question Teresa asked in the chat. Each country had its own decision-making process about prioritizing. Some gave to the elderly first, some gave to healthcare providers first, some gave to the more vulnerable, disabled individuals. What can we do to protect the vulnerable within countries if and when they do get the vaccines? For example, my concern is, what if vaccines are allocated to a country in great need, but are then delivered first and foremost to the rich and powerful, to the political elite, rather than being delivered in a timely fashion to those who are most vulnerable to the virus? We cannot control one country through the government of another country. Can the allocation system have a built-in mechanism to protect the vulnerable internally?
Yeah, and I think the other point to remember, or at least to highlight, is that I think public health dynamics vary by region and by country. And this is why it's very, very important that, public health institutions are detached from politics, because politics is what messes public health delivery systems most of the times. So to allow, politicians, I'm using the term loosely, to allow politicians to start calling the shots on which, for example, which priority group should get the vaccines first, is a very dangerous precedent to set. And I'm going to continue on this path to say, I think this is a problem that we have seen even in the past and even in this current pandemic. This is why I also agree that we should not allow innocent citizens to suffer the consequences of, ill-conceiving politicians who may have an agenda or two on their sleeves. I think the ultimate objective is the protection and the preservation of human life, even if that human life happens to be within the borders of a politician who does not value it as much. So I would say the best approach would be to allow public health institutions or ministries of health in respective countries and regions to actually do their job. If they run the analysis, they do the assessment, and they feel that this particular group of people is highest at risk and it would serve the country better to start from there, then that is how it should go, away from the politics.
Yes, Gita, and then we'll hopefully move to one last challenge.
Okay, thank you. I just want to reiterate once more what I said. And Zeke, I was happy to see that we could agree on another point, which is that, in fact, I completely agree with you. People cannot be held to ransom because of what their governments do. Governments are whatever they are. And I mean, if that were the case, poor Americans would be in deep trouble if they were held responsible for all of the previous president's actions. But having said that, and I mean, in a sense, you could say people suffer enough when they don't have adequate governance or decent governance to not add further suffering to them. But I do think that the IPR question is critical, because I do believe that the rules of the game question is the critical one that we're talking about here. And the intellectual property rights problem, when it comes to health emergencies of this kind, the WTO itself produced those so-called TRIPS flexibilities for public health, the possibility of compulsory licensing. The problem with it is that you take any one product, a single vaccine, and it doesn't have just one patent on it. It has a million things. It has so many patents on everything coming from so many different directions that it's extremely difficult, because the TRIPS flexibilities of compulsory licensing have to be done product by product, country by country. And that is why the argument has been made that for the period of time that the pandemic is with us, waive intellectual property rights on vaccines and the other products related to. I know you don't agree. Let me make my argument. For this period, not for all time, not permanently, but for the period when you've got such a severe emergency. The argument for it coming partly from an ethical side and partly, I mean, I don't have a problem with profits being made. The issue is this: much of the investment that goes into the production of these products is actually coming from the public sector. If Moderna, Pfizer, and others want to claim that they are actually investing huge sums and therefore they deserve a reward by way of high profits, they need to open up their books better than they have. They've never been willing to open up their books. Pharma has never opened up its books because they know it's not true. And all one has to do is to work at it, and people have done that. Work from the other side. How much money has the US government put into Moderna? And you can see where the profits are coming from. So the absence of an incentive, it's a great incentive if I spend very little and earn a huge amount. Of course it is. And of course I'll kick and scream if anybody tries to reduce that. I don't think it has to be done on a case-by-case basis. I think it has to be done by changing the rules of the game for the current time. Therefore, I think that, and I am 100% in support of the waiver. However, let me go back to the point I made earlier. I think the game has changed. What CIPLA did for Africa during HIV/AIDS by way of reducing the price of ARVs from over $10,000 to $100 is going to be done by China with Sinopharm. Already, I barely tweeted that today saying, hey guys, have you realized what's happened? My WhatsApp was packed with responses from people in Zimbabwe, Botswana. Zimbabwe said, last 3 weeks, we've got Sinopharm coming in. Botswana said, from next week, we're going to get Sinopharm coming in. Forget it. It doesn't matter. All that's going to happen is the same thing that was the problem during the HIV/AIDS pandemic. The big pharma did not really care. They were not into or about producing drugs for Africa. What they didn't want was the African price to fall, which would affect their profits within the US. US drug prices will depend on what happens here. Now, because you've got the Biden administration happily giving you free vaccines to everybody, you're not paying that price. But that is the challenge. They're not particularly interested in the market in these countries because we're never going to be able to pay those prices that they want. So you're going to sit with these intellectual property rights and have nothing available, except, of course, as I said, the game has changed already. China is there, China's producing, never mind your intellectual property rights, keep them. We will produce and we will flood the African market with Sinopharm, Sinovac, and everything else. Furthermore, watch the turning of American hegemony into Chinese hegemony as a result of having the entire LMIC world thankful to China for giving it vaccines. Sorry to instill that bit of real politics, but I think it's a real politic to pay attention to. And if I were advising the Biden administration, I would say, hey, the game has changed. You're going to lose it to China if you don't sort of change the rules of the game. Sorry.
Well, Gita, no, you and I agree a lot.
Coming back, then I'm going to come back at you. Okay.
I think this is a major moment of battle for hearts and minds, and soft power is critical, and vaccine is critical to soft power. I will put in the chat a op-ed I wrote last week in the Wall Street Journal calling for export of the vaccine on multiple grounds, one of which is geopolitics consideration. So you and I totally agree on that. Second, we do disagree on the patent issue. I don't think this is a patent issue because Moderna has said it's not enforcing its patents. Has that made a difference about production of Moderna? No. There's a very complicated process of 180 different raw material inputs that are not easily mastered. It's know-how of the production that's critical. And I agree that needs to be shared worldwide. We need to beef up production capacity worldwide, but that's not going to happen overnight. You and I know that's a minimum of a year, probably 2 years. And the best way to produce these things in massive quantities is to get the factories that are up and running with the know-how, doing as much as possible and exporting them around the world for fill finish capacity. The last point I would—
4 months, Zeke.
There's no 4 months. Even when— that's false. Even when Lonza took over a factory that had clean rooms, it was a 6-month process. And that's not 4 months, and that's a factory available. Let me just say one fundamental point, which is the worst. Let's go to the worst scenario. The worst scenario is nobody develops a vaccine because no one has an incentive to develop a vaccine. That's the worst scenario. And we need to be careful that we don't create that scenario. And I do think, and I'm fully in agree with you, Gita, I'd love to have the pharma books open. I'd love to see how much is public, how much is private. What we do know is there's a complex ecosystem necessary that was present in the UK, present in the US, but was not present in other countries that allowed success in this situation, in this research situation. And we should not throw out the baby with the bathwater. That multiple companies jumped in, many of them flamed out, but some succeeded, is extremely important. And we want to encourage many people to jump in and make production. All of us would be worse off if they didn't. And the last point I would make is Sinopharm, it's great that they're sharing. We should be very clear-eyed about it. They haven't shared their data clearly. They haven't run their trials by Western standards of predetermined endpoints. And third, the Chinese themselves admit that their vaccines aren't as effective as either the mRNA or the adenovirus vaccines. And we need to be clear about that too.
Pfizer, Moderna vaccines aren't even useful in tropical countries.
If Masoka has very last words, we cannot get to, we have an incredibly rich questions on the issue of incentives and more equitably incentivizing vaccines that I would love to have had time to get to. So I will let Masoka have the last word in 3 minutes, and thank you everybody very, very much for coming.
The worst scenario is not for nations not to manufacture vaccine because there is no incentive. The worst scenario is for the survival nation to be threatened because they don't manufacture vaccine because of profit. It's clearly with the symbol with the Ebola. When it was first discovered in Canada, it was never considered because it was an African disease. But when the West became very threatening their survival, they accelerated the research and development. So the worst scenario is never going to be the profit. The rest is going to be that in every human being is to survive and for the generation after them to survive. So because that is the worst scenario that we all want to survive, there's never going to be a time where we say we are going to be driven only by profit. When they cut the check, it comes to the fundamental human survival. If we keep that in the back of our mind, front center, that is what we are discussing is about our fundamental existence as human beings. You now have mutations that go after young people. Nations are shut down, hoping that there are going to be mutations that our current diagnostic may not pick up, except countries want to be island and isolate themselves. History has taught us no nation succeeds by being an island. And so the worst scenario is not to lay down every other thing and think about our fundamental survival for us and our children unborn. The legacy will leave for our survival as a human being. That's one thing you carry us to bed every morning, going to bed and say, are we doing enough to save ourselves and the rest of humanity? Because trust me, we are all the same. Thank you very much.
And with that, we are very much running out of time. So thank you very much to our panelists and to everyone who joined us today. And we hope to see you at many other events.